Let's take a look now at some of the stories making headlines in the media across the world. And we begin with the Financial Times. And no surprise, its UK front page features the first interest rate rise here in a decade. We'll look at what that means for the economy. Let's move to Vox now. It explains how Pope Francis has made the rare move of updating Catholic teaching. It now calls the death penalty inadmissible. To the South China Morning Post, and the paper leads with a study carried out in the Hong Kong metro, which shows how germs spread across the network and how they vary depending on the time of day. British tabloid The Daily Mirror claims an exclusive. It says Amazon has declared its lowest corporation tax in 5 years in the UK. That's despite soaring sales. And we'll explain their other main story, how the Scottish couple had their winning lottery ticket ripped up in front of them. And finally, The Sun. Well, it is sunny, isn't it, after all? It looks at the heat wave hitting Europe. Temperatures are rising across the board. So let's begin now. And Stephanie Hare is back with me to look at those stories. And Stephanie, first of all, let's talk about UK interest rates. We were expecting this. Banks had been factoring this rate rise in, but it is really the way that we're seeing most central banks moving, a tightening of monetary policy. Can you explain to us why they're doing this and what that tells us about how the economy is working? Because it does tell us a lot, doesn't it?
Well, it's really interesting. So what we're looking at here is really a battle to sort of tame inflation, right? So we wanted to have easy money before, after the financial crisis of 2008, and the big question there is how do we stimulate growth, because they wanted to make sure that people were working. Unemployment's really low in a lot of countries now, so they can tighten interest rates. But I think it's also really important to say that this is a potentially risky strategy. Unemployment is low, but it's not good employment, right? So a lot of people are underemployed. They're working part-time when they'd like to work full-time. Maybe they're not making enough money. There's still been wage depression. And also here in the United Kingdom, it's a really risky move because, of course, we've got this political risk factor of Brexit. If this happens, if we go through with this next year, that could affect growth in ways that I'm sure the Bank of England Governor Mark Carney is thinking about.
You wouldn't quite think he's a risky kind of guy, would you? So what do you think is behind this move? If he can see Brexit looming on the horizon, if you know the employment figures don't tell the full story, why do you think this quarter-point rise happened?
I think right now he's acting consistently with the other central banks around the world, so we're going to be expecting them to be moving in tandem. But there's always the flexibility that if the United Kingdom decouples from that next year and has to have its own sort of policy package, if you will, the Bank of England will act accordingly.
And of course, it's going to be a blow for homeowners with mortgages because they're going to see their mortgage rate rising. But savers, a little bit of good news, at least for them.
A little bit of good news for savers who haven't had much good news in the past decade.
No, well, quite exactly. OK, let's move on, because this story in Vox tells us about Pope Francis. Now, he's officially updated Catholic teaching. Now, Catholicism will call the death penalty inadmissible. Up until recently, it didn't quite have that viewpoint, did it? Talk us through what exactly has changed and why it's so significant.
Well, first of all, it's significant because this is kind of a unilateral move from the Pope. So he has updated the Catechism, which is this document and this doctrine of teachings that has existed since 1992. And he's now saying that there's in no circumstances a need for the death penalty because there are other ways of punishing somebody that allow for redemption. And of course, redemption is a key tenet of the Catholic faith, right? So redemption and atonement, etc. So it's a very interesting political move because, of course, the death penalty still exists in the United States. It still exists in many countries around the world where there are practicing Catholics.
I was actually reading the other day, interestingly, because I was on holiday in France, that the last person to be guillotined in France was guillotined in 1977. That's not as long ago as you would expect, is it?
Yeah.
And the interesting thing here is that hardline Catholics are not happy about this, are they? Because they are worried this will move away from the literal teachings of the Bible.
Yes, which I think is, again, really interesting that particularly here in Europe, we have this move towards secularism, but there are people for whom this is still very much a live issue. This is a debatable issue. And again, it's this question of, can the Pope do this on his own rather than taking people with him?
Which he has done, really, hasn't he?
Well, that's sometimes the sign of a leader, right, is you get out in front.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's talk about germs. How do you deal with germs?
I feel cold coming on, as you can probably hear from my voice.
Really, stay away from me. Don't touch me, don't come near me, don't breathe
because I
on
was
me.
riding the tube,
no,
as the story discusses.
Yes, well, the London Underground is, you know, I have this rule, right, where I don't actually touch the side of any kind of, you know, handrail on the Underground. And if I do, I just try to kind of clean my hands. I'm a little bit, you know, funny about these things.
No, it's really intelligent because the tube is a gigantic petri dish. And what's really interesting about this article in the South China Morning Post is this concept of introducing hand sanitizers, which I think anyone living in London would love to see, because of course they have to combat in Hong Kong, where this article is discussing the metro system there, they have to combat SARS and other different diseases that are breaking out.
What are they saying? They're saying that in this article that different bacteria were found at different times of the day.
Yeah.
How do they differ? What's the difference?
Well, it depends, because you get the influx of people on the morning commute, first of all, and there's like 11 different lines on the system, so everybody's going around and they're literally tracking the movement of the germs, right? And then over the course of the day. But in a way, it's also important, right? Human beings need to be exposed to germs in order to keep our resistance going. So sometimes like being too clean.
You're right, some germs are important, other germs not so much. Let's move on. Daily Mirror. Amazon, of course, has been hugely controversial in terms of tax in the UK, and the story is rearing its head once again. According to this report, Amazon has paid £1.7 million in corporation tax. I think it's, in the UK. It's the lowest UK corporation tax bill in 5 years. And the point of the story is that the UK high street, as we know, has been suffering. We've seen so many shops closing down, diminishing the number of stores. Amazon is, getting bigger and bigger, and yet the government's not seeing the benefits.
Yeah, I mean, it's a policy failure. You can't have a company that is fast on the heels of Apple to have $1 trillion in market capitalization not paying fair tax. And of course, they can afford all of the offshore tax protections and all of the lawyers to work every single international tax law to their advantage, which the average person on the high street, those small businesses, cannot afford.
It's important to say that Amazon has said that it pays all tax that it's required to in the UK and every country where it operates. It says corporation tax is based on profits, not revenues, and our profits have remained low, given retail is a highly competitive, low-margin business.
I mean, they would say that, right? In the sense that they're going to work within the law. I'm sure that they absolutely are working within the law.
Yes, no, there's no accusation that they're not.
That's where it's a policy question, right, in terms of what is the British government doing to counterbalance that? Because Amazon is global and it can shop around to get the best tax deal, which of course it does, and will keep its money offshore. So
let's talk about money. £58 million. This couple in the Daily Mirror. It's another story by the Red Top. £58 million. They scooped the money, but they nearly didn't they? Because the shop worker tore their ticket up. What happened?
Well, he scanned it and thought that it was just going to be one of those cases where I don't play the lottery, but I have watched people who do. You go in and it gets scanned and it looks like you won like £500. And normally the shop would pay out that money. But in this case, it was £58 million and he had already sort of torn it up and thrown the ticket away. So
their
they had
hearts
to
must
dig
have just
it.
dropped right at that point. They must have thought that Camelot was not going to come up with the goods.
Yeah,
but they did.
the technicality.
£58 million. What would you do if you won that kind of money?
I would set up scholarships so that children could get education around the world.
Oh, Stephanie, you're so good. I was going to say I'd buy a house in the south of France. I'd buy myself a Mercedes. No, you're right. Absolutely, that's what you should do with the money. Yeah, okay. I wish I hadn't asked that because I make myself look really bad. Let's move on because I want to bring in talking about the weather. Now, I know we love talking about the weather in the UK, and you obviously probably have got into that living here. Yeah. A massive heat wave. I know we can joke about it, but it has actually brought about quite a lot of worrying symptoms. For example, people have actually been dying, haven't they? I mean, why is the weather getting so hot, Stephanie? Global warming, clearly.
Global warming, we keep belching out pollutants into the atmosphere, so things are getting hotter, the air is more toxic, so you're getting respiratory illnesses. You also just get people who are not used to this kind of weather, so you're learning how to juggle keeping your temperature down, staying hydrated, learning when you need to stay out of the sun. It's almost like we're having to adopt practices that you would see in countries closer to the equator. Perhaps we'll start seeing a siesta here in Northern Europe.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because, I mean, the countries in Europe, like, for example, Spain and Portugal, apparently are going to be seeing temperatures in the high 40s. How do you even leave the house when it's that hot?
Well, you don't. I mean,
You have to. What if you have to go to work and...
Well, but even in countries that are closer to the Mediterranean, you would often see that siesta culture as a way of coping with heat, right? It isn't about being lazy, as it can sometimes be impugned if you come from a northern, cooler country. It's about restructuring your society, so people will work in the morning or they'll work at night. So in places like Spain, it's really normal for people to be out at sort of 1, 2 in the morning. They don't even have dinner until 9, 10 o'clock at night. And the afternoon is this sort of dead time where everybody's resting just to kind of stay out of the heat. And that's really common in countries closer to the equator. So we may actually see human beings start to adjust to climate.
Yeah, they might have to, mightn't they? I mean, the interesting thing is that you have countries like the UK, we're not used to the very hot weather, so things do tend to kind of fall apart a little bit. I've been asking viewers to tell me about their advice in the hot weather around the world. We've had pretty interesting ones, including keep, a wet cloth and drink lots of water, use air conditioning. What's your advice, Stephanie, in hot weather?
Stay hydrated, sunblock, so you don't get sunburned.
Or even a hat. Why has no one mentioned a hat? Do you wear hats?
Yeah, I wear a hat and I wear big sunglasses to protect my eyes because you can get
eyes
glare
are an important
burn.
thing as well. Okay.
Yep.
Good advice there, Stephanie Hare. Thank you very much indeed. That's all we have time for on this business.